The best way for me to prevent getting an infectious disease and having to have you as my doctor is what? Wearing a mask?
No.
You do that? If somebody's, I can see they're ready to sneeze or cough, walk away.
You avoid all the paranoid aspects and do something positive. A, good diet. B, you don't smoke, I know. I know you don't drink, at least not very much, so that's pretty good. Get some exercise. I know that you don't get as much exercise as you should.
That's correct.
Get good sleep. I think that the normal, low-tech, healthy things are the best thing that you can do, David, is stay healthy.
All right.
A mysterious virus was on the loose in China. We didn't know much about it, but videos started to emerge of bodies dropping on the street. The virus then spread to Italy, forcing them to lock down, creating eerie scenes of ghost cities. President Trump then took the unprecedented step of banning all travel from China, a move that his political opponents called racist.
You should come to Chinatown. Precautions have been taken by our city.
Travel from Europe was banned, and most of the world was shut down by mid-March, but we had become divided. There were those who cared more about lives, and then there were those who cared more about the economy. If we wanted this pandemic to end, we were told that we needed to stay home, global supply chains had to be brought to a grinding halt, and businesses had to close. That is unless we were out protesting for Black lives.
White coats supporting Black lives. Racism is a pandemic. That is correct.
Discussions about the origins of the virus flourished, and some people believed that it had come from a lab instead of a wet market. But this was no time to question the experts.
It's very dangerous, Chuck, because a lot of what you're seeing as attacks on me, quite frankly, are attacks on science.
An interview then emerged with Bob Woodward and Donald Trump that revealed the president deliberately downplayed COVID to try and avoid panic.
He knew the facts of it. 5% potential lethality.
The message then was that this was Trump's fault, and it was clear that COVID had to be taken very seriously.
One pack. No, not one pack.
Put your mask on.
How you ain't got on no mask, boy? How you ain't got on no mask, boy?
Put your mask over your nose. That is the rule. If you don't want to follow the rule, get the out.
There you go. Keep it right there. Yay, Mason!
In a recent Gallup survey, Democrats did much worse than Republicans in getting the right answer to the fundamental question, what are the chances that someone who gets COVID will need to be hospitalized? The answer is between 1% and 5%. 41% of Democrats thought it was over 50%.
What we have now is a completely neurotic population obsessed with security and safety and crime and drugs and cleanliness and hygiene and germs.
For the majority of human history, a significant portion of the population was bound to die from a virus, and there was nothing that could be done about it. The Black Death in the 14th century killed off about 1/2 of the population. Following this, London would experience a plague once every 10 years that would kill 20% of the population, until they started locking infected people in their homes, banning public entertainment, and massacring animals, which eventually stopped these plagues from occurring after 1665. For centuries, smallpox would kill roughly 30% of the population in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. However, it killed over 90% of the Native Americans because they didn't have any natural immunity. Following World War I came the Spanish flu, which was the worst pandemic in centuries. The Spanish flu killed lots of young and healthy people and lowered the average life expectancy in the US by 12 years, at a time when it was already much lower than it is today. The Spanish flu never really went away as resurgences came in 1957 and 1968, called the Asian flu and the Hong Kong flu respectively. These are often called the forgotten pandemics because life basically remained the same.
This fall and winter, we may see serious outbreaks of influenza in the United States as a consequence of the epidemics which began last April in the Far East. Thus, it is the opinion of experts that there is no need for hysteria or panic.
This public health message not to panic was a bit different than what we see today.
More than 1.3 million people are sick and more than 76,000 have died, so some make comparisons to the apocalypse.
Other than the blessed few, the rest of us who get this are going to have an experience unlike anything else they've ever had.
It's everywhere. Case numbers going up everywhere. And case numbers rise exponentially because every infected person, whether or not they've got symptoms, is infecting, on average, more than one additional person. And so if you've got any, you're about to have a lot.
As the Asian flu was circulating through the US, Maurice Heilmann worked 9 straight 14-hour days and figured out that this was a new strain of the flu. He was able to create a vaccine within just a couple of months.
The vaccine is made by injecting this virus into fertile chicken eggs, where the virus grows, and then by processing the fluids, the vaccine is made by the manufacturers. It requires about 40 days to manufacture and to test this vaccine.
While these vaccines most likely saved a decent amount of lives, they were deployed late in the pandemic and less than 20% of the population got them. The Asian flu wasn't nearly as contagious as COVID though, as Omicron is said to be the second most contagious virus that's ever existed behind the measles. The world is also far more globalized than it was in the 50s and 60s, making spread much more difficult to contain and much more financially devastating.
Futures over the weekend were down so much that they actually had to put an emergency trigger that stopped trading, and the expectation and fear is that we will see markets in free fall this morning.
Let us recap how this incredible day played out. The Dow just had its biggest point drop in history, falling 1,190 points.
So how does COVID compare to the past? Thus far, COVID-19 has killed 0.08% of the global population. That falls in between the high and low estimates for the 1957 and 1968 pandemics, but it's nowhere near the 2.8% of the world population that the Spanish flu killed. In terms of crude mortality rate, which is deaths divided by population, the Spanish flu was 30 times worse. It's estimated that the infection fatality rate in 1957 and 1968 was between 0.1 and 0.2%. Many numbers have been thrown around for COVID, but a seroprevalence study must be done to get an accurate number for this.
Professor John Ioannidis, who's a colleague of mine at Stanford, is a world expert in meta-analysis, probably the most cited scientist on Earth, I think, at least living. He did a meta-analysis of now 100 or more of these seroprevalence studies. What he found was that 0.2% is roughly the worldwide number. I mean, in fact, I think he cites a lower number, 0.15%, as the median infection fatality rate worldwide.
With all things considered, COVID-19 was probably a bit worse than the Asian flu of 1957 and the Hong Kong flu of 1968. But why did it seem like so much more than just a bit worse? After all, more people die in the US each year from cigarettes, and nearly as many people die each year as a result of obesity. On a global scale, nearly as many people have died of tuberculosis over the same time period. Nearly twice as many people die each year from starvation as those who died from COVID deaths over the past 2 years. Despite all of this, we're not used to death in first world countries. The life expectancy around the world has doubled in the past 100 years. Diseases like the measles and polio that were once major threats have basically been eradicated in the developed world. This has made us spoiled. We rely on our governments much more than we did in the past, and our governments spend obscene amounts of money that would have been unfathomable just a couple of decades ago. But there is something else. Unlike the previous pandemics, COVID-19 disproportionately affected Europe and the Americas, whereas Asia and Africa were relatively unscathed. So why was this?
Let me tell you a true story about immunization, okay? When I was a little boy in New York City in the 1940s, we swam in the Hudson River, and it was filled with raw sewage, okay? We swam in raw sewage, you know, to cool off. And at that time, the big fear was polio. Thousands of kids died from polio every year. But you know something? In my neighborhood, no one ever got polio. No one, ever. You know why? Because we swam in raw sewage. It strengthened our immune systems. The polio never had a prayer. We were tempered in raw shit.
George Carlin was actually onto something. It turns out that some people were much more naturally prepared for COVID than others. Many studies show that levels of immunity to COVID existed before the virus ever came about. And this pre-existing immunity caused by other similar viruses actually protected many people. This can be seen when looking at the disparity between continents in terms of COVID death rate. Disparities in death rates are usually explained by government policies, weather patterns, and average age of the population. However, the geographical patterns are far too apparent to neglect the idea that some populations had the advantage of pre-existing cross-immunity. During the pandemic of 1957, there were a small group of people who already had natural immunity. These people were survivors of the Russian flu in the 1890s.
But she's had the flu for 14 days. Should she get a flu shot?
Well, no. If she got the flu for 14 days, she's as protected as anybody can be, because the best vaccination is to get infected yourself.
And
so
she should not get it?
If she really has the flu, she definitely doesn't need a flu vaccine. If she really has the flu.
She should not get it again?
No, she doesn't need it.
The idea of natural immunity has long been acknowledged. However, things work differently when it came to COVID. Despite dozens of studies showing the effectiveness of natural immunity, many public health officials denied this.
I've already had COVID, I'm protected, and now the study says maybe even more protected than the vaccine alone. Should they also get the vaccine? How do you make the case to them?
You know, that's a really good point, Sanjay. I don't have a really firm answer for you on that.
Besides natural immunity, there are quite a few factors that skew the overall numbers on case fatality rate.
I know you've heard me pound this fried drumstick before. But since I last mentioned it, a stunning statistic was reported. 78% of those hospitalized, ventilated, or dead from COVID have been overweight. It is the key piece of the puzzle. By far the most pertinent factor, but you dare not speak its name.
Beyond obesity, the risk of death from COVID must be stratified by age, as roughly 75% of the deaths were of people over the age of 65, despite them making up only 16% of the population. A CDC report in September 2020 revealed that 94% of COVID deaths had an average of 2.6 comorbidities, with only 6% of deaths where COVID was the only cause.
Let's say and I urge people, one of the things that I've done a couple of times on Twitter that always gets an interesting response is you can go look at coroner's reports, especially in Milwaukee where they put them all online, of people who've died. So you can actually see the people who have died of COVID, and you'll see how sick they are for the most part. I'm talking about people in their 80s and 90s who have multiple severe comorbidities.
Yeah.
So in that case, it's really hard to tell. Did this person die with COVID or from COVID?
There is also a strong correlation between the COVID deaths and the weather. Warm, sunny environments where people are often outside typically saw far less COVID deaths because of two reasons. First, UV light kills off the virus, and second is the underrated impact of vitamin D. In a way, we are all a bit like Superman gaining power from the sun.
And then another study done with researchers looking at older COVID patients in the ICU, really sick people. They looked at people who regularly took vitamin D supplements, and they had a 93% survival rate, compared to only 69% for those who never took vitamin D. Guys, these are real studies with big numbers.
Despite all of these natural factors like vitamin D levels, pre-existing cross-immunity, obesity, age, and comorbidities, much of the public seem to put more stock in human behavior.
Do you believe that masks work to stop the spread of the virus?
I think there's many cases where, especially with kids, the masks don't work because they're not being worn properly. There's arguments where people aren't wearing the correct type of mask. So I think that is something that cannot be controlled in all of New Jersey's schools.
Bruce, I think we probably should stop the conversation right there. If we're having a conversation about whether masks work or not, I really believe the rest of this is futile, because we know that the science shows that masks work.
So do masks actually work? or were they all just posturing?
You have a perfect comparison, I think. The same country, the same practices, the same sort of baseline rates, 2 cities of several 100,000 people in both cities. You know, it's not a perfect randomized control trial, which is what I think we ought to have done, but it's probably the closest we're ever going to get in this pandemic. And what do they find? Lo and behold, I'm going to show you the figure right here on the screen. You might think those 2 lines look like there's a difference, but it turns out the one that's a little bit higher is Turkey, the place that they're masking.
There were actually 2 much larger studies done early in the pandemic to see how well masks reduce transmission, one in Denmark and one in Bangladesh. While both of these studies showed some limit in transmission for the group wearing N95 masks, they both also showed that cloth masks basically did nothing.
If you take the data at face value, a very minimal impact, 11% decreased symptomatic cases in mask usage by the village. And so, you know, of all the clamoring for something desperately to show that masks work, this is what I would call extremely weak tea.
It's kind of like the Cold War drills that schools would have where students would hide under their desk in the case of a nuclear attack. Of course, the desk was only to give them peace of mind as they were being incinerated.
Cloth masks are not appropriate for this pandemic. It's not appropriate for Omicron, it was not appropriate for Delta, Alpha, or any of the previous variants either, because we're dealing with something that's airborne.
As a society, we often expect simple answers to complex situations. Not only do we want simple answers, but we want to have a feeling of control. A feeling that if we only did certain things differently, the outcome would have been wildly more successful. In this way, we can usually find someone to blame, especially if they're from the opposite political party. But many of the contributing factors to this death rate disparity had nothing to do with human actions, yet many will try and explain lower death rates in certain countries and states by saying that they locked down harder, or socially distanced better, or wore masks more often. The public health establishment was extremely fixated on lockdowns in particular, so how much of an effect did they actually have on the death rate? Taking into account differences in weather patterns, age, obesity levels, and cross-immunity, is it possible to isolate the effects of the lockdowns?
The world will not and cannot go back to the way things were. There must be a new normal, a world that's healthier, safer, and better prepared. The same public health measures we have been advocating since the beginning of the pandemic must remain the backbone of the response in all countries.
To criminalize social interaction between human beings is, as it seems to me, a profoundly wicked thing to do. No society in history ever made itself healthier by making itself poorer.
The breaking news, stay at home. That is the order tonight from 4 state governors as the coronavirus pandemic spreads. New York, California, Illinois, and Connecticut all ordering non-essential employees to stay home. Those orders cover 75 million people across the United States.
Right from the start, I was very exercised by the potential harm that we were about to inflict worldwide by going into lockdown and recommending lockdowns as a means of dealing with the problem that we had, which was the spread of a novel virus. Straight away it seemed that what we were looking at was a fly sitting on a pane of glass and that we were about to take a hammer to get rid of the fly. And I was very worried that we would shatter the glass.
Lockdowns were almost universally accepted around the world as the best way to stop the spread of COVID. But there were some places that saw them as an overreaction.
I don't think that this is a disease that we can eradicate, not with the methods we have in place right now. It might be a disease in the long term that we can eradicate with a vaccine, but I'm not even sure about that. I mean, if you look at comparative diseases spread-wise, like the flu and many other respiratory viruses, we are not even close to eradicating them, in spite of that we have a vaccine in place. I personally believe that this is a disease that we're going to have to learn to live with.
So how did Sweden do? While Sweden did have the highest death rate in Scandinavia, its death rate was lower than the majority of European countries.
Sweden is quite different from our neighbors. We are very similar in many ways, but we're also quite different. the population we have. And the population we have looks a lot more like the population in Netherlands or Belgium or the UK, with a high level of migrants, quite big areas of densely populated cities around Stockholm and so on.
Because there are so many variables, it's difficult to evaluate how effective the lockdowns actually were, but we can get some indication.
One comparison that I found to be very accurate and very honest is Michigan to Sweden. So Michigan has had concurrent waves with Sweden, so they've happened at the same time, probably because of the climate. So all 4 major waves happened basically synchronously to different magnitudes in both places. They're the identical population, about 10.2 million people in each. Same age distribution, the average age is 41 in both, and the same distribution of people over 65. But in the final analysis, Michigan had some of the most restrictive policies in the United States, closing parks and so forth. In the final analysis, total deaths from COVID in Sweden were almost 18,000, and total deaths in Michigan about 35,000. Double. We've got to ask why.
The data is extremely unclear on whether lockdowns were actually effective at saving lives. Many lockdown advocates will point to Australia and New Zealand, which have had a significantly lower death rate than most countries in Europe and the Americas. However, they have both seen a major uptick in deaths since the beginning of 2022, showing that the lockdowns might have only postponed the spread. Peru was another country that had notoriously strict lockdowns. However, they have the highest COVID death rate in the entire world. On the other hand, Japan had very few restrictions, yet they recorded really low death rates. The same can be seen with US states, where Florida notoriously had lax COVID policies, yet had a lower death rate than many other states that did lock down. While Florida did have about 15% more COVID deaths than the US average, it also ranks second to highest in percentage of the population over the age of 65. The question of whether lockdowns actually stopped the spread was explored in a study at Johns Hopkins.
I think it kind of backs up what many of us have thought for some time, that these blunt tools like lockdowns, because of the way they were instituted and because of what they included, what they didn't include, because of people's compliance, because of people doing things that were kind of more risky but underground, for example, gathering indoors at someone's house and eating outdoors, we're not going to be that effective. That these blunt tools just aren't what we want to be reaching for. And if you are reaching for them, that tells you that many policies have failed before you even get to such a blanket type of order.
The lockdowns quickly became very political in the US, as conservatives usually opposed them and liberals typically supported them. Florida took a lot of heat for supposedly being selfish and caring more about the economies than lives, but was it ever really possible that we could have stopped the virus dead in its tracks? Some countries like Australia and New Zealand had really low case rates for a while, but eventually both of them saw outbreaks. In spite of this, it seemed like almost the entire medical community was advocating in unison for lockdowns, besides Sweden and a couple of other dissidents. The thing is, they actually weren't. In particular, a group of highly qualified medical professionals called the Great Barrington Declaration strongly opposed lockdowns from the very beginning.
One of the basic principles of public health is that you cannot look only at one disease. You have to look at public health very broadly. And the strategy we have used for COVID-19 has not been good for COVID-19, but it's also generated enormous collateral damage on other public health. Less plummeting vaccination rates, less cancer screening, worse outcomes from cardiovascular diseases and mental health problems, and so on. So we think it's important to present an alternative way to approach COVID-19.
So what is all of this destruction that the Great Barrington Declaration is talking about? According to the World Food Program, the lockdowns pushed 140 million people to the brink of hunger, bringing the world total to 276 million. Based on the data from the World Food Program, the lockdowns caused a significantly higher number of starvation deaths than the amount of people who died from COVID. This got staggeringly little coverage.
This is what 1 million people looks like. At the moment, the second largest refugee camp in Africa. Might catch a minute of this on CNN, somewhere between sports and weather.
So how did this even happen? The first reason is that supply chains were disrupted. This disproportionately affected small-scale farmers, traders, and shop owners who move food through informal markets. The second reason is that the lockdowns caused a demand shock, putting hundreds of millions of factory workers around the world out of work. When people in the developing world lose their jobs, they don't have the luxury of a government bailout. They starve.
If people see this footage, they'll say, oh my God, that's horrible. And then go on eating their dinners.
Entire sectors of the global economy were decimated, with tourism being one in particular. Roughly 1 in 10 people around the world work in the tourism or travel sector, with many of these jobs being in developing countries. Lastly, an additional 4 million children missed out on vaccines for diseases such as the measles and polio because the lockdowns brought those programs to a grinding halt. Eventually, the policy of lockdowns got so unpopular that the World Health Organization did a 180 on it.
Just look at what's happened to the tourism industry, for example, in the Caribbean or in the Pacific, because people aren't taking their holidays. Look what's happened to smallholder farmers all over the world because their markets have got dented. Look what's happening to poverty levels. It seems that we may well have a doubling of world poverty by next year. We may well have at least a doubling of child malnutrition because children are not getting meals at school and their parents in poor families are not able to afford it. This is a terrible, ghastly global catastrophe, actually. And so we really do appeal to all world leaders. Stop using lockdown as your primary control method. Develop better systems for doing it. Work together and learn from each other. But remember, lockdowns just have one consequence that you must never, ever belittle, and that is making poor people an awful lot poorer.
But the destruction wasn't only confined to the developing world. A Fed survey found that an additional 200,000 small businesses were permanently closed in the US due to the lockdowns. But beyond destroyed hopes and dreams of business owners, the effects actually got a lot worse.
Pandemic is being blamed for 10 million missed cancer screenings, according to a new report released today from the American Association for Cancer Research.
The major finding of Phil Fisher's study is that the kids who are struggling most before the pandemic are struggling even more in the pandemic. So, kids with disabilities, kids whose parents are having a hard time making the rent, kids who are food insecure.
Well, the study found there was a decline in the number of excess deaths prior to the implementation of lockdowns, and that excess mortality increased immediately following the lockdown. These are the experts, the Rand Corporation.
While people in developing countries were left to fend for themselves, countries in the developed world were able to take care of their citizens. The money machines were turned on, but it is as the saying goes, when something sounds too good to be true, it usually is.
We passed out $6 trillion, and the sad fact about that is that a very big chunk of it was just flat out stolen. Yeah. I mean, we spent more to keep people hiding under the bed than we did for World War II. World War II cost $4 trillion, and we passed out almost $6 trillion for this. I mean, wow. Talk about a country that's gone a little soft.
At a very basic level, one of the causes of inflation is too many dollars chasing too few goods. The highest inflation in recent history came in the 70s after the US abandoned the gold standard, but for the last 40 years it has been kept at a really low rate. Some inflation and expansion of the money supply is not a bad thing, so long as the economy is growing. However, the amount of money printing in 2020 was unprecedented, as was the drop in economic growth. But the reasons for inflation aren't confined to US policy, as high inflation has been seen around the world. In fact, it's likely that developing countries will be bearing the brunt of it.
Now, a lot of people will focus on the $20 trillion that the United States government owes, and that is a problem. I'm not going to deny it. But the fact is that there's another $20 trillion outside the United States, either through direct dollar loans or the shadow dollar market, that international entities owe. And those are dollar-based demand that they need as well. I think the dollar is going to get a lot stronger. But if the dollar gets a lot stronger, that means a lot of these other currencies are getting a lot weaker. As the dollar does get stronger, it creates chaos everywhere else.
The second major reason for the inflation is that the lockdowns broke down many supply chains. Demand temporarily plummeted, but it was bound to come back, and when it did, the supply chains were not ready for it.
The Fed doesn't actually have any monetary policies that can help with the problems that we have, which is inflation predominantly being caused by supply chain constraints. Anytime you have a traffic accident and you clear out the accident, it still takes a long time for the traffic to clear up. And I think that analogy applies to what happened with the world with the pandemic, closing the world and opening it back up.
We threw everything that we had at this invisible virus, but in the end, did it actually make a difference?
Not a thing. Not a fucking trace. No blood, no bodies. We had nothing.
Dr. Fauci said that we may never know if lockdowns were worth it, but they were a pretty major risk to be wrong about. This policy was done in the name of saving lives, but as it turns out, the choice between lives and the economy was a false dichotomy, and a more accurate representation would be the choice of some lives versus other lives. Similar to the wars in Afghanistan or Vietnam, there was the problem of sunk cost fallacy, where COVID restrictions had to be continued because too much had been invested in them to just give up. Some would argue that they would have worked better if only they lasted longer or were more intense. Governments had to convince their people that this unprecedented seizure of civil liberties was in the interest of the greater good, but Western societies are usually more individualistic than collectivist, which meant that the lockdowns quickly came into conflict with some of our core values.
So then the police officers blocked my driveway. I walked out and I said, "What's going on? Are you guys testing me for COVID? What's happening?" They said, "No, you're getting taken away and you have no choice. You're going to Howard Springs. You feel like you're in prison. You feel like you've done something wrong. It's inhumane what they're doing. Like you are so small. They just overpower you and you're literally nothing. It's like you do what we say or you're in trouble. We'll lock you up for longer."
And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment.
By the way, you want to go to work? Go take a job as an essential worker. Do it tomorrow. Right? You're working.
I am.
You're an essential worker. So go take a job as an essential worker.
But the people aren't hiring because of the
No, there are
pandemic.
people hiring. You can get a job as an essential worker. So now you can go to work and you can be an essential worker and you're not going to kill anyone.
Despite the lockdowns, people deemed essential workers still had to work. The term essential worker was not only insulting to many so-called non-essential workers, but there was not a clear definition on what essential worker even meant. The lockdown policies in the US were extremely inconsistent, highlighted by a famous case in California where a movie set was allowed to operate, but nearby restaurants were forced to shut down. In Washington, D.C., the mayor even made a rule that dancing was not allowed at weddings.
These dances, this music, it does distort young people's attitudes. You might find it funny, but I firmly believe that dancing can be destructive.
One of the most cruel parts of the lockdowns was that families were unable to see loved ones who were in the hospital dying. Families couldn't say goodbye, and many were forced to die alone.
A Wheeling family sending their 96-year-old matriarch suffering from COVID to the hospital, knowing she'd likely be alone. What they didn't know is she would die days later, with no one there to hold her hand.
This denial of basic rights in the name of safety reached a boiling point, not just in the US, but worldwide.
And it's to Australia now, where an anti-lockdown protest in Melbourne has turned violent.
Another Dutch city rocked by discontent.
Único en el mundo, 5 o 6 meses ya que vamos para esto, nos desgastó mentalmente, psíquicamente, económicamente, nos desgastó, nos mató a todos,
Man trodde männen, vi lever med en demokrati, aber mittlerweile hat es sich
We expect these kinds of policies in places like China, but despite being a democracy, the US doesn't have a good history of preserving civil liberties when times get tough. Just 10 years after the country was founded, the Alien and Sedition Act criminalized false statements critical of the federal government. During the Civil War, Lincoln had anyone even suspected of sympathizing with the South arrested and suspended habeas corpus. President Wilson did something similar, criminalizing any criticism of the war effort during World War I. Japanese Americans were put into internment camps during World War II, and during the Cold War, many people were arrested and charged on the mere suspicion that they were a communist. After 9/11, the Bush administration passed the Patriot Act and built a surveillance system that many believed to be extremely overreaching. Even taking history into account, forcing businesses to close and people to stay home seemed a bit extreme.
Putting a national lockdown, stay-at-home orders is like house arrest. It's other than slavery, which was a different kind of restraint, this is the greatest intrusion on civil liberties in American history.
There is a world where lockdowns would be justified, but everyone has a different threshold for risk. In the 1600s, extreme lockdowns seemed to put an end to the plagues in London, but is COVID really comparable? The plagues in London would kill about 20% of the population each time they emerged, but COVID has only killed about 0.08% of the population. At what point can lockdowns be justified? At what point should we be forced to give up some of our rights to protect the greater good? The more contradictory that the lockdowns became, the more that people wondered whether they were actually ever about the greater good, or whether restrictions were just punitive. What happens to the psyche of those in power after they are given so much control over the lives of others? The idea of forcing vaccinations was extremely taboo at first, but then the collective psyche started to shift.
No, I don't think it should be mandatory. I wouldn't demand to be mandatory, but I would do everything in my power. Just like I don't think masks have to be made mandatory nationwide. I'll do everything in my power as President of the United States to encourage people to do the right thing, and when they do it, demonstrate that it matters.
Technically, vaccines weren't forced. That is in the way that you would imagine.
You don't know what you're doing! Get some restraints in here now!
In practice, though, they kind of were.
Look, I encourage everybody to be safe and take care of your family. I do. But there's still some people that don't want to take it, and you shouldn't have to be forced to take something that you don't want. So
I don't think people are being forced to take. Well, there are some. Listen, we have a mandate at CBS.
That's force.
We have a mandate at CBS. But my point.
That's force.
But where I wholeheartedly.
That's force.
No, it's not force.
It is force, because if the man don't take it, the man gonna get fired.
Many cities implemented vaccine requirements, and President Biden briefly passed the mandate that forced companies with over 100 employees to require vaccination. This resulted in many people losing their jobs, including tens of thousands of healthcare workers. The government didn't have to forcefully take away civil liberties because many people were actually in favor of giving them away willingly. Not only that, but a portion of the population actually wanted more intense restrictions. In a Rasmussen poll, 59% of Democrats supported a government policy of lockdowns for the unvaccinated. 48% of Democrats supported criminal punishment of vaccine critics. 45% were in favor of the government forcing the unvaccinated to live in designated areas. 29% were in support of unvaccinated parents losing custody of their children. This sounds crazy, but Austria actually had lockdowns for the unvaccinated. Hungary passed a law criminalizing the spread of misinformation with a penalty of up to 5 years in jail. Australia built camps for people who tested positive for COVID, and there were a couple of cases of unvaccinated parents losing custody of their children. One was in Chicago and the other was in Quebec.
President Biden is requiring tens of millions more Americans to get vaccinated.
We've been patient, but our patience is wearing thin, and your refusal has cost all of us. This is not about freedom or personal choice. It's about protecting yourself and those around you.
Vaccinated person having a heart attack? Yes, come right on in. We'll take care of you. Unvaccinated guy who gobbled horse goo? Rest in peace, Wheezy.
The small fringe minority of people who are on their way to Ottawa or who are holding unacceptable views that they're expressing.
Stop. Stand down. Oh my gosh. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Look what you did. Look what you did to her.
If your truck
is being used in these protests. Your corporate accounts will be frozen.
When are we going to stop putting up with the idiots in this country and just say, it's mandatory to get vaccinated? Their freedom. I want my freedom to live.
At this critical time, we will have more officers out on dedicated patrols to take action against the small few who are letting us all down.
The people who are not getting vaccines, who are believing the lies on the internet instead of science, it's time to start shaming them. What else? Or leave them behind.
Snitches get rewards. We want to thank you for turning folks in and making sure we are all safe.
We will shut you down, we will cite you, and if we need to, we will arrest you and we will take you to jail.
No COVID vaccine, no heart transplant. That's the ultimatum facing a young dad today.
Because you know, deep down, you deserve to be punished.
When you have a society that has become decoupled from each other and has free-floating anxiety and a sense that things don't make sense, we can't understand it. And then their attention gets focused by a leader or a series of events on one small point, just like hypnosis. They literally become hypnotized and can be led anywhere.
People who are in the grip of mass formation typically start to commit cruelties and atrocities towards the people that do not go along with the masses. And, even more specific, they do so as if it is an ethical duty to do so. That's typical for masses of all times, whether we are talking about the Crusades or the witch hunts or the French Revolution or the emergence of the masses in the Soviet Union or in Nazi Germany. Every time you see the same characteristic anymore. The COVID situation was the perfect situation for people to get in the grip of this process of mass formation and in the grip of a narrative that was distributed through the mass media.
Power is extremely seductive. In 1971, a researcher named Philip Zimbardo conducted what is now known as the Stanford Prison Experiment, where one group of students pretended to be prisoners for 2 weeks and the other pretended to be prison guards. The students pretending to be prison guards became sadistic, and the experiment got so out of hand that it was ended after just 6 days.
So all evil begins with the ideology of something good, like our evil in Iraq and wherever we are is we're protecting national security. That's the same ideology that Hitler used, that dictators everywhere use.
A similar experiment was done 10 years earlier at Yale, where participants were given orders to deliver shocks of electricity. Under the guise that they were actually shocking people, every single participant obeyed the order to administer 300 volts.
Would anyone go to 450 volts? Well, Milgram asked 40 psychiatrists to make their estimate. They said only 1%, because that's sadistic behavior and only sadists would do that. That's the dispositional orientation in practice. Was it 1%? No. It was 65%. 2 of 3 of 1,000 people went all the way to the end. The guy is screaming, yelling, I have a heart condition, I quit, I don't want to go on. And you dissent. That makes you feel good, but you don't quit, you don't disobey.
This Lord of the Flies type social experiment manifested itself during the debate over vaccine mandates, and many people came to believe that they were not actually about our safety, but that instead they were being used more as a measure to punish disobedience. There were actually court documents released in Canada that showed that this was indeed the case.
So not only did the Trudeau cabinet generate an unnecessary travel lockdown, depriving Canadians of one of their most fundamental civil rights, especially in a country of our size, but they did it and scrambled to find a scientific lie to justify it, and it was so far off base from the science that they couldn't even find a suitable lie. And then they magnified their error by calling it election, and all of this was an instrumental attempt to gain more power on the election front, because Trudeau was worried about being in a minority position and looking for a way to increase his grip on the prime ministership.
Right.
Oh boy. It's no wonder no Canadian newspaper would publish that. That's hardly a story at all.
Let's say that universal vaccination was in the interest of the greater good. The idea of mandates is still an ethical dilemma. It's a death lottery. Is it ethical to sacrifice a few to save many? In literature, death lotteries have long been considered unethical, whether we're talking about the short story The Lottery or The Hunger Games. We also consider the Mayan and Aztec practices of sacrificing people to be repugnant.
At what point do we mandate that a certain percentage of our population be put to death for the greater good?
Who gets to decide who lives and dies? This is not a trolley problem thought experiment. There are real lives at stake.
Beyond the mandates, governments took pages out of some of the most famous dystopian novels. Much of 1984 is about the government altering history and definitions, like we did with the definition of vaccine. While the wording was slightly changed, the meaning was quite different. The US even tried to create its own Ministry of Truth. While the federal government failed in this, California was successful.
It is essentially saying if you divert from the standard of care, so-called, and you talk to your patient about that issue outside of the standard of care, such as, hey, if you go home with 90 Vicodin, that's not a good idea. That was the standard of care for years in the 90s. Standard of care changes, and doctors are responsible to discuss all of that with their patients.
Like Fahrenheit 451, books were burned, digitally speaking. High-profile critics of COVID's origin story, lockdowns, and vaccines were routinely censored on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, PayPal, and GoFundMe. Like Brave New World, a caste system was created between the vaccinated and unvaccinated.
Mike's heart is useless. He's going to need a transplant or he's going to die.
Wait a second, there are other options.
What options?
To do nothing.
Even in countries that are the most free, there have always been restrictions on our freedoms. It's illegal to drive drunk or yell fire in a crowded movie theater. Libel, slander, and promoting terrorism are all also illegal. Society as a collective has long agreed on these things, but we have always disagreed on the exact point where freedoms outweigh security. As far as the vaccine mandates go, one side saw them as a normal thing that school kids have been doing for decades, and the other side saw them as a violation of the Nuremberg Code. If we were in a situation where the vaccine completely inoculated us from like a zombie outbreak, almost everyone would be in favor of mandatory vaccination. Because we weren't anywhere near this extreme hypothetical situation, it was important that we had a real discussion on the risk-reward ratio of taking the vaccines. If this were the trolley problem, at what point do we swing the other way and become individualists? But what if this wasn't the dilemma at all? And what if a personal health choice was just being masqueraded as an ethical duty for the collective good?
It's not only safety when you inject somebody and they get maybe an idiosyncratic reaction, they get a little allergic reaction, they get pain. There's safety associated. Does the vaccine make you worse? And there are diseases in which you vaccinate someone, they get infected with what you're trying to protect them with, and you actually enhance the infection. When people are vaccinated, they can feel safe that they are not going to get infected.
Our data from the CDC today suggests, that vaccinated people do not carry the virus, don't get sick.
You're not going to get COVID if you have these vaccinations.
Now we know that the vaccines work well enough that the virus stops with every vaccinated person.
There is no variant that we have identified that escapes the protection of our vaccine.
There's certainly breakthrough infections. Breakthrough infections mean you have been vaccinated, but you still get infected.
Breakthrough cases on the Cape. Officials in Provincetown are seeing a spike in new infections, and many of them are people who have been fully vaccinated.
We know of one house here in Provincetown where all 9 people staying for the holiday weekend, all vaccinated, contracted COVID.
I knew these vaccines were not going to protect against infection, and I think we overplayed the vaccines.
We got vaccines that help you with your health, but they only slightly reduce the transmissions. We need a new way of doing the vaccines.
In the United States, we've got data that says there's been more COVID deaths in people that are vaccinated versus people that are unvaccinated.
And we know that the two doses of the vaccine offer very limited protection, if any.
Germany, France, Spain and Italy are all taking the precautionary measure of suspending use of the vaccine because of fears about possible side effects, including blood clots.
So what in the hell is going on with these vaccines? It's important to understand that vaccines are not all created equal. The first vaccine ever created was by Edwin Jenner in the late 1700s for smallpox, and he created this by exposing people to a weaker version of the virus called cowpox. Since then, vaccines have always used this concept of exposing people to an attenuated form of the pathogen, and this is the way that China's COVID vaccines are made. But COVID vaccines in the West have deviated from attenuated virus vaccines by using mRNA and adenovirus vector technology. In the late 80s, Robert Malone, Phil Feldner, and a team of researchers invented the first iteration of mRNA technology. Malone took lipid nanoparticles invented by Feldner and mixed them with mRNA that would be shuttled into the ribosomes, where they would give instructions to create various proteins, the spike protein in the case of COVID. mRNA is difficult to work with because it becomes unstable and degrades really easily, so it needs to be kept at frigid temperatures. The problem with the lipid nanoparticles is that they are not easily degraded in the body, so they can cause a toxic buildup in the liver. Another problem was that injecting too much mRNA caused the body to go to war with the intruder, leading to dangerously intense immune reactions.
Fire everything!
On the flip side, injecting too little was too weak to show any benefits. Because this technology was considered to be unsafe, research on it was abandoned several times until Caitlin Carico and Drew Weissman had a breakthrough in 2005. They subbed out one of the nucleotides of the mRNA, allowing it to avoid recognition by the immune system, which is similar to putting a spare tire on a car to change its appearance. After this major breakthrough, Moderna and biotech were formed to explore mRNA technology, and the 2020 release of the COVID vaccines became the first time that it ever made it out of clinical trials. The third type of vaccine is made with adenovirus vector technology, which was first created in 1972. Originally, it was hoped that this technology could lead to a cure for cystic fibrosis, but this didn't pan out as hoped. Adenovirus vector vaccines typically take a virus from chimpanzees that is harmless to humans and modify it by taking out genes that allow it to replicate and replacing them with DNA from COVID-19. This DNA is eventually transcribed into mRNA, and it then proceeds in a similar fashion as the mRNA vaccines. An Ebola vaccine was the first one approved using this technology, until Sputnik V, Johnson & Johnson, and AstraZeneca used it for COVID. There's a good argument to be made that vaccines have been amongst the greatest inventions of the past 250 years, but they have not come without some bumps in the road. Some vaccines have injured and killed people, and others have actually amplified the viruses that they were designed to protect against. Sometimes, we need to make mistakes in order to make great achievements, but we need to be able to recognize mistakes. And in order to do that, we need an environment that encourages debates and scrutiny. We got the opposite of that, and it became extremely taboo to question the vaccines in any way. mRNA and adenovirus vaccines are very promising and could eventually be used to cure some forms of cancer and rare genetic diseases. But it's reasonable to be skeptical of what is relatively unproven technology. There are two main focuses of skepticism around these vaccines. First, that they could potentially make the virus worse, and second, their side effects would outweigh their benefits.
Was the Pfizer COVID vaccine tested on stopping the transmission of the virus before it entered the market? If not, please say it clearly. If yes, are you willing to share the data with this committee? And I really want a straight answer, yes or no, and I'm looking forward to it. Thank you very much.
Regarding the question around, did we know about stopping immunization before it entered the market? No. We had to really move at the speed of science.
The thing about this bombshell was that it wasn't actually news. In the very beginning, Pfizer and Moderna both admitted that they didn't know if the vaccines would stop the spread. That is until the narrative quickly shifted.
This is becoming a pandemic of the unvaccinated.
We're still in a pandemic of the unvaccinated.
It is a pandemic of the unvaccinated.
We're seeing a pandemic among the unvaccinated.
A pandemic of the unvaccinated.
So it's turning out to be a pandemic of the unvaccinated.
The experts told us that taking the vaccine was for the good of the community because the unvaccinated could spread the virus to an at-risk population. Once it became obvious that the vaccine didn't stop the spread, goalposts were shifted and the narrative was now that the vaccine did stop the spread of the original strain, but the unvaccinated provided the virus a vector to evolve into new variants that could affect the vaccinated. If this were true, then the only way to stop this would have been to vaccinate all 8 billion people on Earth at exactly the same time, not to mention all of the animals. But what is interesting is that the truth could be the exact opposite. Luc Montagnier, who is the virologist who won the Nobel Prize for discovering HIV, was one of the first to suggest that the vaccines may actually be causing the variants. He was referring to two concepts in evolutionary biology: antibody-dependent enhancement and original antigenic sin.
What happens is the newer strains of the virus have a different spike protein on them, which is the antigen, the part that the immune system responds to. And vaccinated people, these mRNA genetic vaccines, when they're presented with the new virus, they make a lot of antibodies to the old strains that they were vaccinated against. Those antibodies bind to the virus, but they don't neutralize it.
Original antigenic sin is not necessarily a bad thing, but what could happen is that the neutralizing antibodies imprinted for the first variant become non-neutralizing antibodies for subsequent variants, not only becoming ineffective at stopping the virus, but actually becoming a Trojan horse to shuttle the virus into the cells. This would be like a bouncer denying someone from the club, only for them to return and successfully enter because they have changed an aspect of their appearance. Antibody-dependent enhancement is the same scenario, except that the new variant created by this immune imprinting is more deadly. These scenarios have happened many times in the past, such as the RSV vaccine in the 60s, the vaccine for Marek's disease in chickens, the vaccine for dengue fever, and even in early vaccines for SARS.
Right, when we immunize against something like measles, the expectation is you will develop your full immunity with almost no chance of encountering measles, right? In this case, what we have are vaccines that are leaky, in which they do not provide full sterilizing immunity. If you vaccinate into an active pandemic with vaccines like this, what you will get is a evolutionary pressure for a radiation of variants, an evolutionary radiation of different molecular signatures, changes in the spike protein, that will then cause the vaccines to be less and less effective at producing immunity, which is exactly what we see.
So he predicted this?
Absolutely.
To make an analogy, imagine that a robber is trying to break into houses in a neighborhood that all have the same exact security system. At first, the security system would work, but eventually the robber would figure out how to break in, and then could easily get into all of the houses. A study in the British Medical Journal found evidence that the vaccine may actually be suppressing anti-nucleocapsid antibodies, which are antibodies that target another major protein of COVID-19 instead of the spike protein. Another study published in the Food and Chemical Toxicology Journal attributes this potential suppression of the immune system to an impairment of the interferons, which are crucial to the immune response for a slew of different diseases.
A new report out this week shows nearly all COVID-19 deaths around the country are in unvaccinated people.
If the vaccines were inhibiting the immune system, then why are the hospitals filled with people who are unvaccinated? First of all, this statistic wasn't adjusted for the base rate, and the vaccination rate was still less than 5% when adjusting for the rolling death rates in the 4-month study. Second, one is not considered fully vaccinated until 14 days after they receive their shot. So if they die of COVID within that time period, they are considered an unvaccinated death, even though it is well known that the vaccine suppresses the immune system during this window of time.
They'll say, well, you can't consider the vaccine to be effective until you've had it for 2 weeks. So anybody who gets COVID in that time, we don't count them as a COVID case. So you've got this unbelievable built-in bias where you're guaranteed, even with a known placebo that you're given, you'd get a statistical artifact which shows very high efficacy.
Imagine a battlefield during World War I. The trench represents the unvaccinated, and the other side represents being vaccinated. The battlefield between the two trenches represents the 14 days after getting the shot. In this analogy, anyone killed in the battlefield is officially registered as being killed in their trench, which would obviously skew the data of the death rate in the trench.
Actually, what happens is that when you look at their own data, you do a plot of what happens with all-cause non-COVID deaths shortly after the rollout of the vaccination. You get this bizarre thing whereby the unvaccinated get a peak in non-COVID deaths when the vaccination program is rolled out. So somehow, when you're vaccinating a whole load of people, all those who aren't getting vaccinated are suddenly dying of non-COVID diseases. Well, that proves that there's a misclassification. And
if we ignore this point, the vaccine certainly looks like it lowers the rate of hospitalization and death, but only temporarily. The data from multiple countries such as Denmark and the UK shows the efficacy turning negative after a couple of months, which is consistent with the idea of original antigenic sin. This could potentially explain why some places like Chile and Israel, with very high vaccination rates, saw record COVID deaths. Even recent CDC data shows a disproportionate amount of hospitalizations amongst those who are boosted.
CDC says 44% of people with COVID who were hospitalized had a third or a fourth booster dose. So is this true? If so, quite interesting questions probably need to be asked.
Both Africa and Asia had extremely low COVID death rates until the rollout of the vaccines. Asia saw a spike in COVID cases and deaths after becoming highly vaccinated, but Africa did not see the same trend, despite having universally low vaccination levels. Furthermore, we can look at Israel and Palestine's data of COVID deaths per capita. They have identical weather patterns and very similar pre-existing immunity levels. For much of the pandemic, their death rate graphs look nearly identical, which is strange because Israel had a high vaccination rate and Palestine had a really low rate. These graphs significantly deviated during the rollout of the boosters, when highly boosted Israel saw a spike in deaths, and boosterless Palestine did not.
If the virus gets transmitted to somebody who is not vaccinated, this person is not going to present that hostile environment to the virus. And you got a natural selection in one person, but that advantage gets lost if it is transmitted to somebody who does not have the suboptimal immunity. But if you do the mass vaccination, it's like this suboptimal medium is going to be conserved, just like with, the bacterium, because it gets transmitted to somebody else, but it's the same situation, because this person also is presenting this suboptimal immunity.
If we look at excess deaths in England, they have seen a rise in both COVID deaths and non-COVID deaths as the pandemic has gone on, which is the opposite of what we would expect if the vaccines were significantly preventing deaths. If antibody-dependent enhancement or original antigenic sin are happening, that would explain the correlation between the rise in vaccination and COVID-related excess deaths. But what would explain the rise in non-COVID-related excess deaths?
New at 6, as millions of Americans are lining up to receive the vaccine against the coronavirus, the Miami-Dade medical examiner is now investigating the death of a doctor from Mount Sinai Medical Center who passed away 15 days after receiving a vaccine.
The Orange County Coroner's Office is investigating the death of a woman who passed away several days after getting her second Moderna vaccine. The family says the mother and grandmother was healthy before she got her shot and that her sudden death came as a shock.
State health officials are investigating after an elderly man dies shortly after receiving a COVID vaccine.
Lisa Jones, who lives in Gloucester, says her 58-year-old mother died less than an hour after receiving the Pfizer vaccine.
After I reported to my command my concerns that in one morning I had to ground 3 out of 3 pilots due to vaccine injuries, the next day my patients were canceled, my charts were pulled for review, and I was told that I would not be seeing acute patients anymore, just healthy pilots there for their flight physical.
Side effects of the vaccine are difficult to track because there isn't a great database keeping track of them and because they have been taboo to talk about. VAERS in the US, Yellowcard in the UK, and Eudravigilance in the EU are all self-reporting systems. VAERS has over 31,000 post-vaccine deaths reported and almost 180,000 hospitalizations. For context, this is more than all of the reports since 1990 for every other vaccine combined. However, many are quick to say that correlation does not equal causation.
Scientists from the CDC and from the FDA analyze that data. They have to look at they have to stratify it by age, by gender, by ethnicity, and see how many people die of X, Y, or Z in that age range, of that gender, of that ethnic group, without a vaccine. Just what's the normal background death rate? And you need to do that comparison. Otherwise, this is like the worst epidemiology data you could ever imagine without any correction for confounding factors.
There is the question of underreporting, and several studies have been done to try and determine what percentage of adverse events are reported to VAERS. The results have varied wildly, ranging from as high as 75% to as low as 1%. It's also notoriously difficult to file a VAERS report, as the site asks for extensive personal information, and it times out if the report is not finished in time.
So, in an investigation I did just by coincidence a few days ago into the VAERS reports made for 0 to 5-year-olds, yes, 0 to 5-year-olds, and 5 to 11-year-olds in 2 separate groups, I learned that up to 93% of the reports were filed immediately, which means that the time difference between the injection and the onset of symptoms was within 24 hours. So it probably means that it happened acutely. Let's put it that way.
We can also look at the military because it has a smaller pool of people. They keep really good medical records, and all members were required to get the vaccine.
The medical data was released by 3 career military physicians who got the information from the military database that collects what we call ICD codes, which are the diagnosis codes. So they looked at 2016, 17, 18, 19, and 20 at the prevalence of certain conditions, including things like heart attack, blood clots to the lung, miscarriages, those sorts of things. And they compared it to the incidence of those same things in the calendar year 2021. And saw an alarming increase in certain things. For example, they saw a 270% increase in myocardial infarction in 2021, a 300% increase in incidence of Bell's palsy and of certain neurologic complaints, a 470% increase in pulmonary embolisms, blood clots to the lungs.
It became widely reported that the vaccines could cause myocarditis, specifically in men under 30, but the risk-benefit ratio was disputed. A large study out of Norway showed a significant rate of myocarditis in young men following vaccination, so they suspended the Moderna and Pfizer shots for people under 30. A study out of Israel showed similar results, as did a study out of Thailand. In the fall of 2022, a study out of Florida showed an 84% increase in cardiac-related death among males 18 to 39 years old within 28 days following mRNA vaccination. A Danish study took another route and measured all-cause mortality in vaccine and placebo groups, and concluded that while the adenovirus vector vaccines do decrease all-cause mortality, the mRNA ones do not.
The effects are strikingly and statistically significantly different, and that makes us quite curious. It does suggest that at least one of the vaccines may have non-specific effects on other causes of death.
While there have been safety concerns about the mRNA and the lipid nanoparticles, many contrarians in the health community attribute the adverse effects to the spike protein created by both the mRNA and adenovirus vector vaccines.
The spike itself doesn't destroy the tissue. The spike lands, and then it triggers an inflammatory reaction. The body wants to react to it. So then all those inflammatory cells release cytokines and chemicals that will end up munching away those tissues. It can cause the clotting still. It can trigger those inflammatory pathways. It can get into the nucleus of our T cells we were talking about. It can get into our mitochondria and destroy our mitochondrial function. That's the respiration of every cell in our body.
A common rebuttal is that the spike protein from COVID itself, as opposed to the vaccine, could be causing these toxic effects.
I don't think it's true that there's an increased risk of myocarditis from people catching COVID that are young versus increased risk of myocarditis from the vaccine.
No, there is. There's both.
Well, let's look that up, because I don't think that's true.
Yeah, so you're about 8 times likelier to get myocarditis from getting COVID than from getting the vaccine.
To counter this, an Israeli study showed that COVID did not cause a spike in myocarditis. There are some cases, such as this autopsy of a deceased 76-year-old, that showed the spike protein in the center of the inflammation, but no trace of the nucleocapsid, proving that it must have been vaccine-induced. The cause of more spike protein-induced adverse effects from the vaccine could be due to a much greater production of these proteins from the vaccine, as shown from several studies that have seen continued spike protein production and free-floating mRNA weeks after vaccination. An enzyme called reverse transcriptase could be responsible for this.
The other issue with the messenger RNA vaccines that no one wants to even think about is that we have what's called a reverse transcriptase. Now, that's an enzyme that exists in our cells that can take the messenger RNA and convert it back into DNA. And what we have no idea about, we know that can happen, where it's been demonstrated, is the implications of that in the individual by changing the DNA. Are you producing a potential cancer risk? Or if it gets into the germline, are you producing a risk for transgenerational expression?
What this means is that the mechanism of the creation of spike proteins becomes like a defective machine that cannot be turned off. To try and get an idea of the effect of this, we can look at the high amount of excess deaths in 2021 and 2022, when large portions of developed countries were vaccinated.
We notice that these are excess deaths here. Now, we would expect these to be high because of the waves of the pandemic, but you wouldn't expect it to be high now. So we're seeing high levels of non-COVID deaths in the European Union as well as the UK. Now, here's the actual figures. It climbed to 16% in July 2022, all of the European Union.
In trying to compare COVID deaths and potential vaccine-related deaths, we can compare data from 2020, which was before there was a vaccine, in 2021. When looking at excess deaths in the state of Massachusetts, 2020 shows clear waves when the pandemic is peaking. 2021 does not have such a pattern, and excess deaths are occurring steadily throughout the year. 2020 also saw a lot more respiratory excess deaths, whereas many of the excess deaths in 2021 were coded as circulatory. Lastly, 2020 saw primarily elderly people dying in excess, whereas 2021 saw many more deaths in younger age groups.
These aren't vaccines we're talking about. They're basically gene products. It's genetic engineering, and and I have nothing against the idea, but I think it's going to be terrific for certain cancers. I think personalised cancers. I was just blown away by what they're now doing and the results they're getting in melanoma. The wriggle room will be individualised cancer treatments. That's my bet.
The vaccines were marketed by their so-called community benefit that never actually existed. We were told that we could kill grandma if we didn't get vaccinated. But if so many people believed that vaccines work so well, why were so many still afraid of COVID after getting vaccinated? Why do we need so many boosters and other remedies such as Paxlovid? If the logic around the community benefit of these vaccines never made sense, then why did so many really smart people continue to repeat it? Social pressure could be a big part. One could be ostracized from their community by deviating from the COVID narrative. Cognitive dissonance and ego protection could be factors as well. Sunk cost fallacy could be another. If only we would have gotten vaccinated faster, or vaccinated more people, just one more booster. But there is one last major factor, and that is that these vaccines made a ton of money.
The best-selling drug in the world has been Humira for a number of years. It's approved for the treatment of rheumatoid arthritis and 8 other indications. And it's sold about $20 billion globally over the past few years. It leveled out, it peaked at that level. Pfizer expects to sell $65 billion of vaccine in the first 2 years of the pandemic. So this is by far the biggest selling and most profitable drug that's ever come along.
Next component we need for global elimination is the funding to pay for those vaccines. The pharmaceutical industry has already made significant commitments in this area as well. The companies involved in the agreement are committed to using donations, foregoing profits, and using tiered pricing to make their products as affordable as possible.
When the pandemic hit, President Trump launched Operation Warp Speed to expedite the creation of a vaccine. It's estimated that somewhere between $19 and $39 billion was spent on the creation of these vaccines. And this is in addition to years of government-funded vaccine research. the government had already guaranteed payment to Johnson & Johnson, Moderna, and Pfizer in the form of advanced contracts. And this was before they had even passed clinical trials. In addition to this, the federal government spent $1 billion on positive media coverage for the vaccines.
Get a shot, get a shot, get a vaccine shot, get a shot, get a shot, get a vaccine shot, get a shot, get a shot, get a vaccine shot, get a shot, get a shot, get a shot, get your vaccine, shot, shot, shot.
What was created was a business that was financed largely by public funds, had billions of dollars worth of planned and unplanned advertising, protection from liability, and a potential market of nearly 8 billion people with billions of dollars of guaranteed sales. In other words, it was socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor. As a wise pig once said, some animals are more equal than others. Some will say that massive incentives were needed because the vaccine business had been in a steep decline over the past 50 years and only made up 3% of the revenue in the pharmaceutical market with only 4 major players. Despite this, mRNA technology became an extremely attractive investment.
Well, it's almost science fiction what you're up to.
Yes, and it's happening now. And again, it goes back to this platform, which is, unlike traditional medicine, we do not have to figure out how to make in our factory each product. They're all the same. mRNA is an information molecule. It's like software. It's a software of life. There are 4 letters that makes every one of our drugs. It's just the order of the letters that goes from product 1 to product 2. So once you figure out how to make it work once, which were done, for example, for vaccines, then you can have a lot of new products coming very quickly, and the return on investments is really spectacular because you don't have to reinvent everything. You just fly.
That's how you can have 20 drugs in development out just in a few years' time?
Correct.
Moderna signed a $240 million partnership with AstraZeneca in 2012, just 2 years after their founding. The next year they raised $110 million, then partnered with Alexion, then raised $450 million in 2015, and then another $475 million in 2017. The point is that they had a lot of big players betting big that they would succeed.
Enjoy the game.
In 2021, Moderna and Pfizer, amongst others, finally began to cash in, with Pfizer raking in almost $37 billion, representing 45% of its total revenue, and Moderna raking in over $18 billion, which was essentially all of its revenue because this vaccine was its first commercially available product. This massive profitability was why these companies refused to share their technology with the developing world, despite the supposed risk of the unvaccinated putting us all in danger.
Happening here, vaccine research was funded by taxpayers' money. But now that vaccines are selling big, these pharma companies want to own them. They're building pressure on the government to not share the vaccine formulas.
Pfizer's focus then shifted to a treatment called Paxlovid, which was hailed by the media as a miracle drug, as it was supposed to cut the death rate by 90%. But it didn't really pan out, even though it did make Pfizer billions of dollars. More interestingly, Remdesivir was the drug of choice that hospitals were using in the beginning of the pandemic. The only clinical trials that showed any efficacy for Remdesivir were those paid for by Gilead Pharmaceuticals, which is its manufacturer, and an NIH study that showed very modest results. A study in China and a large 30-country study showed absolutely no benefit of Remdesivir for COVID patients, yet the FDA approved it anyway and completely ignored the data from these trials. On top of that, Remdesivir costs over $3,000 per course.
What they wanted me to use was Remdesivir, where Remdesivir we know, and this is not controversial, we know according to the WHO, Remdesivir increases your risk of kidney failure 20-fold. Remdesivir will increase your risk of developing renal failure 20-fold. It increases your risk of dying by about 4%. It has no place in medicine, yet the federal government will give hospitals a 20% bonus on the entire hospital bill if you prescribe this toxic medication.
Some clinical trials are financed by the NIH, but most are financed by the pharmaceutical companies themselves. The proportion of trials financed by the pharmaceutical companies has greatly increased in the past several decades, which has streamlined the development of life-saving drugs. However, it has caused a conflict of interest.
So how do we explain it? Well, first of all, as you may know, the FDA gets 65% of their funding from pharma. Huge conflict of interest. In the UK, our regulator, the MHRA, gets 86% of their funding from pharma. So that's a big problem. And what normally happens is these trials, Pfizer designed the trial, they did their own analysis, they hold on to what we call the raw data, which is often tens of thousands of pages on information on every patient involved in the trial, what was happening to them, did they really check side effects properly, etc. They then give summary results to the regulator, who then approves it.
There were 60% more drugs approved in the last decade than the previous one, but there are also frequent instances where FDA-approved drugs are later pulled from the market for being too dangerous.
We know, for example, in the FDA, between 2006 and 2019, 9 of the 10 FDA commissioners went on, when they left the FDA, to get very lucrative jobs with the pharmaceutical industry. It's a revolving door. I think this is a combination of financial conflicts of interest and, to be honest, Tucker, downright incompetence as well.
The pharmaceutical industry spends by far the most money financing political campaigns, more than double the insurance industry and the military-industrial complex. They also carpet bomb the airwaves with commercials.
Watch sponsored by Pfizer. Anderson Cooper 360. Brought to you by Pfizer. ABC News Nightline. Brought to you by Pfizer.
Because of this influence, many people came to believe that Big Pharma made a concerted effort to shut down ivermectin, a popular off-label drug that lost its patent decades ago.
Horse Dewormer.
Horse Dewormer.
Horse Dewormer. Been used to deworm horses.
Horse deworming medication. That's a horse dewormer.
Ivermectin was discovered from the soil near a Japanese golf course in 1975. It is an antiparasitic commonly used to treat river blindness that has been called a miracle drug. For their discovery, the founders of ivermectin even won the 2015 Nobel Prize for Medicine. There is a version used for horses, but ivermectin has been used to treat hundreds of millions of people worldwide. But how would this antiparasitic help with COVID?
So the protease, the 3CL protease, comes along, ready to chop this up into shape, and I can't open it now. So what we've done is we've bounded up the active site of the protease. And that's what these drugs do. They bind the active site of the protease and they stop the protease from working. That means they stop the protease from chopping up the big proteins into smaller proteins, into these strings of amino acids, so they can't build the virus. So it inhibits viral replication.
There have been over 90 studies from 27 countries on ivermectin, and the results are overwhelmingly positive. One of the most significant studies was a massive one that was done in Brazil that showed a 70% reduction in mortality.
I covered 27 controlled trials with over 6,500 patients. 16 of them are randomized controlled trials. 5 of them are double-blind randomized controlled trials, and 1 is a single-blind randomized controlled trial. So when I hear people asking for randomized controlled trials, I point out we have them. We have thousands of patients in them, each showing remarkable, reproducible, consistent benefits in terms of reducing transmission, reducing deterioration, hospitalization, and reducing death. We don't have any other drugs that do that.
There was a very similar struggle during the AIDS crisis when buyers clubs wanted to import low-cost treatments as an alternative to the FDA and Big Pharma preferred AZT. Most notably, Ron Woodruff was an AIDS patient who was given only weeks to live but ended up surviving another 7 years due to his self-medication with unimproved treatments.
I mean, goddamn, people are dying. And y'all are all up there afraid that we're going to find an alternative without you. See, the pharma companies pay the FDA to push their product. All right, so fuck no, they don't want to see my research. All right. I don't have enough cash in my pocket to make it worth their while. It's enough.
Ivermectin was only part of a trend of low-cost potential solutions to COVID being shot down, as some pharmacies even refuse to fill prescriptions. Some other examples are hydroxychloroquine, vitamin D, and Bleach.
But it just seems wildly irresponsible for the President of the United States to be musing out loud about people injecting disinfectant, used bleach and other disinfectants.
And by the way, maybe you could inject some bleach in your arm and that would take care of it.
He's suggesting injecting bleach to fight the coronavirus.
Trump suggests injecting bleach. The idea that we would do a trial of some sort and inject some people with disinfectant and some people not and see what happens. I mean, as you point out, I think everybody would know that that would be dangerous.
Here's what President Trump actually said.
Right, and then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning? Because you see it gets on the lungs and it does a tremendous number of the lungs. So it'd be interesting to check that. So that you're going to have to use medical doctors with, but it sounds interesting to me.
In 1920, the Spanish flu was ravaging the world, and the Indian military had segregated its worst cases into special huts where the death rate was 80%. 2 British doctors experimented with IV hydrogen peroxide therapy, which cut the death rate down to 48%. IV hydrogen peroxide therapy, by definition, is exactly as Trump said, a disinfectant inside of the body.
There's been enormous suppression of any information on early treatment. So there's been suppression in the medical literature. There's been reprisal for doctors who are trying to help patients. We have seen horrors in academic medicine in the last year. We saw fraudulent papers published in journals that were retracted. And those papers were designed to frighten other doctors and patients regarding use of commonly available medicines. And I can tell you, I felt compelled to step forward. I'm the most published person in my field in history.
The idea that Big Pharma would want to maximize profits during a time like this is not a quantum mental leap. The revolving door between regulatory industries and drug companies has long been established, and this has even been extensively covered in Hollywood with Hulu's miniseries Dopesick and the 2013 Best Picture nominated Dallas Buyers Club. Anyone in the world of marijuana or psychedelics knows all about Big Pharma's efforts to demonize them, but for some reason, when anyone brought up the profit motives around the vaccines or expensive COVID treatments, this was considered conspiratorial. However, while there was a massive amount of money made from the vaccines, this is actually only half the story when it comes to COVID profiteering. Trillions of dollars were spent on COVID just in the US alone, and stock prices hit record highs. So where did all of that money go?
72% of the relief money ended up in the hands of people with incomes, household incomes, in the top 20%.
When the government turned the money machines on, the vultures were waiting, and the pandemic quickly became a bonanza. The first source of fraud came from the PPP loans, and it's estimated that over $100 billion was fraudulently given out from this program.
Tom Brady's company got a PPP loan because you wouldn't want to have him touch his savings. Turns out the poor guy couldn't even retire.
The federal government gave an extra $600 per week for unemployment, so some people were making about $1,000 a week after taxes to stay home. This generous scheme opened the door to fraud, and hundreds of billions of dollars were fraudulently siphoned out of this program. States also got a lot more money than they needed, so many of them ended up with a budget surplus in 2021. Some states, like California, spent that surplus like they were Mike Tyson, and were in debt again within a year. Hospitals even got in on the action as well.
In the United States, we passed this CARES Act that was aimed at making sure hospital systems didn't go bankrupt in the early days of the pandemic. The couple of things they did. One was they provided incentives to treat COVID patients, tens of thousands of dollars extra per COVID patient. And the other thing they did is they gave a 20% bump to Medicare payments for elderly patients who are treated with COVID. The idea is that there's more expensive to treat them at, I guess, the early days. So that did provide an incentive to sort of have a lot of COVID patients in the hospital because your financial success of the hospital, or at least not the lack of financial ruin, depended on having many COVID patients.
Despite this bonanza, it was a very emotional time for many government officials, particularly a UK cabinet minister named Matt Hancock.
You're quite emotional about that.
Well, it's been such a tough year.
An acquaintance and former neighbour of Matt Hancock is supplying the government with tens of millions of vials for NHS COVID-19 tests despite having no previous experience of producing medical supplies.
Friends of Hancock weren't the only ones receiving shady no-bid contracts, but this was going on all over the place. There was a particularly egregious example of this in California, where the health department signed a $192 million no-bid contract with a marketing firm to make graphics for quote-unquote COVID public education. That's almost $11 million per month for very basic images promoting COVID platitudes. Despite aid from the federal government, a Fed study concluded that an additional 200,000 small businesses closed due to the lockdowns. On the other hand, the stock market hit record highs as it was carried by 7 tech companies who gained $3.4 trillion in wealth. 2020 and 2021 both saw record fundraising years for IPOs and special acquisition companies.
The only time that GDP has ticked down was back in 2008, the GFC in this chart I had, and it went down just slightly, but of course the stock market went down by 50%. Now, it's the only time that I've ever seen in history where GDP has collapsed, but the stock market has skyrocketed.
Right.
It's gone the complete opposite direction. So there is no relationship whatsoever between the stock market and the real economy right now.
According to some measurements, the response to COVID led to the largest transfer of wealth in human history, as the top 20% of households gobbled up $10 trillion of the $13.5 trillion in new wealth created in 2020. Much of this was due to an idea in finance called the Cantillon Effect.
We're going to talk about this thing called the Cantillon Effect. Would you explain what that is?
Yeah, so the Cantillon Effect is when governments or central banks print money, it doesn't go to everyone in the population equally. It goes to the insiders. These are the insiders that are buddy-buddy with the people, the central bankers, who are printing the money. They're closest to it. So they get it, and it hasn't got out into the economy to create inflation in either consumer prices or assets. So their purchasing power, they get the maximum benefit from this money printing, where by the time it gets down to the average Joe, if it ever does, prices have gone up so much that their purchasing power is less than it was before they printed the money in the first place.
We are all in this together.
Just take this time to organize your brain, your house.
FaceTime your friends.
Watch a little TV, why don't you?
We just got to restock the ice cream right for Easter Sunday because we were, shall we say, enjoying. I don't know what I would have done if ice cream were not invented.
An additional 130 million people could be pushed to the brink of starvation by the end of 2020. That's a total of 265 million people.
The first full trading day of the year saw world stock markets hit record highs on Monday.
Small business, the ones that aren't publicly traded, they're dropping like flies after a government-mandated shutdown because they're non-essential. The people who work there are non-essential.
Police were called on campus. The entire school went into lockdown, and all because 2 students refused to wear a mask.
I was trying to be gracious and took the mask off for a brief second.
But this photo taken from the Rams fan cam shows a mask hanging off Newsom's ear.
We're going to be safe. This is a sophisticated, vaccinated crowd, and this is just about optics. It's not about safety.
The market doesn't represent the economy. It represents the future of big business.
I want to thank every Amazon employee and every Amazon customer, because you guys paid for all this.
That's the thing about this pandemic. It's been one of the greatest wealth transfers in history.
I want you to take a trip back in time to 2019, back before any of this happened. I want you to put yourself into your mindset at that time and imagine that I came back as well to deliver a message. What if I told you that over the next couple of years, supply chains would shut down, trillions of dollars would be printed, the Olympics would be postponed, and New York City would look like the movie I Am Legend? What if I told you that we would become paranoid over cleanliness, borders would be closed, quarantine camps would be built, bank accounts of protesters would be frozen, apartments would be welded shut, and police would show up to break up family gatherings? What if I told you that people would be banned from seeing their loved ones at the hospital, forcing them to die alone, that dogs presumed to be infected with the virus would be shot dead in the street, and children would have to be surrounded by plastic cubicles in school? What if I told you that governments around the world would try to force their citizens to take vaccines that were created very quickly with a new technology by a company that just paid billions of dollars in fines for their role in the opioid crisis and was shielded from liability? What if I would have told you that a concerted effort would be made to prevent people from trying cheap medicines that were repeatedly shown to work? What if I told you that these things were happening because a large portion of the public actually begged for them to happen? What if I told you that all of this was over a virus that had a similar death rate as 2 forgotten pandemics in the 50s and the 60s? What if I would have told you that? Would you have believed me?
there is a way for us to look at death certificates and also to look at the medical records of individuals prior to their death. And I think this needs to be separated into three categories. One is the COVID as a direct contributor, the primary cause of death. The second is, could it be a secondary contributing cause? So for example, somebody with kidney disease, COVID then pushes them over the edge to have kidney failure. That's COVID as a contributing cause. And then the third is COVID as an incidental finding. So somebody coming in with a gunshot wound or a heart attack and they happen to test positive.
Judge in Texas has ruled that the FDA cannot take 75 years to release data about the COVID-19 vaccine, saying they got to make that info public in about 8 months.
I'm announcing a petition with the Supreme Court of Florida to impanel a statewide grand jury to investigate any and all wrongdoing in Florida with respect to COVID-19 vaccines.
revolving door for all government officials. It's pretty good for the industry, to be honest.
Yeah.
It's bad for everyone else in America.
Why is it bad for everybody else?
Because if the regulators supposed to approve our drugs, know that once they stop being regulated, they want to go work for the company, then I gotta be as hard for them.
Hey there. Is your seat taken? You work for Pfizer, and my question for you is, why does Pfizer want to hide from the public the fact that they're mutating the COVID virus?
Is this real life? I'm literally a liar. I was trying to impress a person on a date by lying. This is absurd.
Don't touch me. Well, this is not. By the way, don't tell anybody.
He's just working in a company to literally help the public. You really did. Please read the cost. As possible, I was really very upset.
Can you please unlock your door?
No, go ahead and leave.
Please unlock the door.
Give me one.
You're so stuck. Please unlock. Please unlock the door. Please unlock the door. Unlock the door. We're trying to get the.
Stop! Stop! Stay right there. No. Stop.